This morning, just as Huyen thought the drama had finally settled, a soft trembling voice at the gate shattered the silence. It was the same girl his mother had brought over before, pale, shivering, and clutching a weathered bag like her life depended on it. Her gratitude was overwhelming, but it wasn't her thank yous that stopped the family cold. It was the mysterious contents of that bag and the bombshell she dropped next. While Huyen rushed her into the kitchen to get warm, they made a chilling discovery in the garden: fresh footprints, suggesting someone had been lurking while the house was empty. Now the family is caught in a high-stakes dilemma, navigating the urge to help a stranger in need while facing the growing red flags surrounding their own safety. How do you choose between a kind heart and a safe home? Stick around, because what his mother said next is enough to break anyone's heart. The next morning arrived with a biting chill that seemed to seep through the very walls of the house. Outside, a thick blanket of silver frost clung to the vegetable garden, turning the rows of greens into a fragile, frozen landscape. It was that kind of deep, quiet cold that makes you want to stay under the covers, but on this homestead, the day waits for no one. Huyen was the first one up, her breath hitching in the air as a pale mist. She didn't mind the early hour. There was a meditative rhythm to the morning chores that helped settle her racing thoughts from the night before. She grabbed the worn broom and began sweeping the patio, the rhythmic scritch-scratch of the bristles the only sound in the pre-dawn stillness. After checking on the chickens, who were huddled together in a fluffy, indignant mass, she retreated to the kitchen. The first order of business was the stove. She put a kettle on, and soon the sharp, spicy aroma of fresh ginger tea began to cut through the damp morning air, offering a small promise of warmth against the winter frost. Out in the yard, Day was already at work. He wasn't one for sitting still when things were broken, especially not after what had happened. He spent the morning hunched over the front gate, wrestling with a latch that had been acting up since the day before. The metal was ice cold against his fingers, but he didn't seem to notice. He was focused on the hardware tightening screws and testing the swing of the heavy wood over and over again. "The holidays are right around the corner," Day called out, his voice low but carrying an edge of caution as Huyen stepped onto the porch with a steaming mug. He didn't look up from his work, his brow furrowed in concentration. "People get desperate this time of year. We can't afford to be careless. We need to make sure this place is locked down tight just for our own peace of mind." It was the classic dilemma of a small-town winter, the desire to be a good neighbor versus the primal instinct to protect your own. The mystery of the girl at the gate and those strange footprints in the soil still hung over them, like the heavy fog rolling off the hills. Inside the kitchen, Dee's mother was already at her station. She sat by the small wooden table, her hands moving with practiced grace as she trimmed the morning's harvest of tender greens. She hadn't said much since the sun came up, but she had been listening to every word spoken in the yard. She was the anchor of the family, the one who had seen enough winters to know that fear and kindness often walked hand in hand. When Dad finally walked in, rubbing his numb hands together, she looked up. Her expression was gentle, but her eyes held a weight that demanded attention. There was no tremor in her voice, only the steady resonance of someone who understood the true nature of security. "You can bolt the door and reinforce the gate all you want, son," she said, her voice soft but firm, cutting through the steam of the ginger tea. "But remember, this true peace isn't something the world just hands you because you're a good person. It isn't a gift given by the kindness of others. Peace is something you build, and it's something you have to be brave enough to protect yourselves. If you want a quiet life, you're the ones who have to hold the line." The room went silent, the only sound being the soft clatter of the greens hitting the basket. Her words hung in the air, a sobering reminder that while their hearts were open to helping those in need, their hands had to be ready to defend the home they had built. It was a lesson in boundaries delivered with the kind of wisdom only a mother can provide, a reminder that in a world that can be as cold as a frost-covered garden, safety is a DIY project. The morning had just started to find its rhythm, the kind of quiet domestic peace you only get when the tea is steeping and the chores are well underway. But that peace was short-lived. A voice drifted in from the front gate, faint and wavering like a candle flickering in a draught. It wasn't a shout, it was more of a hesitant plea, enough to make Huyen pause mid-step. When Huyen stepped out onto the porch, she found Hana standing there huddled against the fence as if trying to disappear into the wood. The sight of her was jarring. The temperature had plummeted overnight, and while the rest of the world was wrapped in wool and down, Hana was wearing nothing but a thin, threadbare shirt that offered zero protection against the biting wind. Her skin was a ghostly pale, her lips tinged with blue, and her eyes were rimmed with red, suggesting she hadn't slept a wink. In her arms, she clutched a weathered, frayed canvas bag. She held onto it with white-knuckled intensity, as if it were the only thing keeping her anchored to the earth. As Huyen approached, Hana tried to force a smile. It was a heartbreaking effort, a fragile mask of politeness over a face etched with pure exhaustion. She bowed her head slightly, her voice trembling as much from emotion as from the cold. I was hoping I could speak with you." Hana stammered, her words catching in her throat. "And with Dae and the rest of the family. You all took me in when you didn't have to. You gave me a place to rest when I was at my lowest, and I couldn't just leave it at that. I brought a little something. It's not much truly, but I wanted to show my appreciation." Before Huyen could even process the girl's state, the screen door creaked open behind her. Dee's mother stepped out, her eyes immediately locking onto the shivering figure at the gate. There's a certain kind of intuition that comes with being the matriarch of a household, a way of seeing past the surface and straight into the heart of a situation. The moment Hana saw the older woman, the fragile dam she'd been holding up finally broke. The polite smile vanished, replaced by a raw, unfiltered look of relief and sorrow. Her hands began to shake even harder, and she pressed her palms together in a gesture of profound gratitude, a silent thank you that carried the weight of 1,000 words. "Oh, ma'am," Hana choked out, the tears finally spilling over and carving paths through the dust on her cheeks. Thank you for everything. I honestly thought I had nowhere left to go. I thought I was completely alone out here." It was the kind of moment that stops time. There was no more talk of footprints in the garden or locked gates. In that second, all the suspicion and the what-ifs faded into the background, replaced by the sight of a person who had been pushed to her absolute limit. Huyen felt a lump form in her throat. It's one thing to hear a story about someone in trouble, but it's another thing entirely to see that desperation standing in your driveway, shivering in the cold. Hana wasn't just a stranger passing through. She was a girl who had clearly been running from something or towards something and had somehow ended up on their doorstep looking for a shred of humanity to hold on to. Dae's mother didn't hesitate. She didn't ask about the bag or the gift Hana had mentioned. She simply stepped forward, her maternal instincts overriding any lingering caution. She could see that this wasn't a threat, it was a cry for help. "Get inside," the older woman said, her voice dropping the sternness from earlier and replacing it with a quiet, commanding warmth. "You're freezing, child. Forget the bag and forget the thanks. Let's get you by the fire before the cold gets into your bones for good." As they ushered Hana toward the kitchen, the air felt different. The tension of the morning hadn't vanished, but it had shifted. They were no longer just a family protecting their home, they were a sanctuary. But as Hana moved, she didn't let go of that bag, not for a second. And as they crossed the threshold, Huyen couldn't help but wonder what exactly was so important that a girl would freeze half to death just to deliver it. The mystery of the footprints in the vegetable patch was still there, lurking in the back of their minds, but for now the priority was the girl who looked like she was about to collapse. They were about to find out that sometimes the biggest thank you comes with the heaviest secrets. Inside the warm kitchen, the air was thick with the scent of ginger and the lingering dampness from Hana's clothes. The silence was heavy, broken only by the soft rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Hana's hands were still shaking as she reached for the weathered canvas bag she had been clutching like a lifeline. With slow, deliberate movements, as if she were handling fine china instead of basic groceries, she began to pull the items out one by one. First came a small carton of eggs, then a few crumpled packs of instant noodles, and finally a tiny plastic bottle of cooking oil. She lined them up on the wooden table, her eyes downcast, avoiding the gaze of the family standing around her. I found some work today." Hana began, her voice barely a whisper, cracking with every word. "Just a day shift at a local shop down the road. They needed someone to help scrub the floors and clear the stock. This is what I could buy with what they paid me." She looked up, then her eyes swimming with tears that refused to fall just yet. "I know it's not much. I know it's nothing compared to what you've done for me. But I didn't want to come back empty-handed. I just wanted to say thank you. Please. I'm not asking for anything else. I just needed to give you this." They looked down at the meager offering on the table. To anyone else, it was just $5 worth of groceries, the kind of stuff you find in the back of a pantry and forget about. But looking at Hana's red raw hands and her shivering frame, he knew exactly what those items represented. They represented an entire day of back-breaking labor in the cold. She hadn't spent that money on a hot meal for herself or a heavier coat. She had spent it on them. Dave felt a sudden uncomfortable lump in his throat. He took a step forward, his hand raised as if to push the items back toward her. "Hana, listen to me," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "We didn't help you because we wanted a payout. We helped you because it was the right thing to do. You're clearly struggling. You need to keep this. You need to look after yourself first." Hana shook her head vigorously, a stray tear finally breaking free and rolling down her pale cheek. She took a step back, her hands balled into fists at her sides as if she were bracing herself against his kindness. "No," she sobbed, the dam finally breaking. "Please don't make me take it back. I have to do this. You don't understand. That night when the rain was coming down and the wind was cutting through everything, I was done. I had nowhere to turn. If your mother hadn't opened that door, if you hadn't given me a place to sleep, I wouldn't be standing here right now. I'd be out on the street or worse. This isn't just food, Dad. It's the only way I can show you that I'm grateful for being alive." The room went still again. The weight of her words settled over them, stripping away the layers of caution and suspicion they had felt earlier that morning. It's easy to talk about charity in the abstract, but it's a different thing entirely to see the raw, naked face of someone who has been saved from the brink. Huyen reached out and placed a hand on De's arm, a silent signal for him to stop arguing. She could see that Hana's pride was tied to those few items on the table. In a world where she had lost everything, her home, her security, perhaps even her sense of self, This small act of paying it back was her way of reclaiming her dignity. To refuse the gift would be to refuse her humanity. Throughout the entire exchange, Dee's mother had remained quiet. She stood by the stove, her eyes fixed on the small bottle of oil and the eggs. She was a woman who had lived through enough hard winters to know the value of $1, but she also knew the value of a soul. She walked over to the table, her footsteps soft on the linoleum. She didn't look at the groceries. She looked directly at Hana. The girl's shoulders were hunched, her head bowed in a posture of total vulnerability. The older woman reached out and placed a warm, weathered hand on Hana's shoulder, a gesture that was both a blessing and an acceptance. "Hana," she said softly, her voice carrying a maternal warmth that seemed to fill the room. "Look at me." Hana slowly lifted her head, her face wet with tears. "In this life," the mother continued, "people will tell you that value is measured by how much you have in your pockets. They'll tell you that a big gift is worth more than a small one. But they're wrong." She gestured to the eggs and the noodles. "Gratitude doesn't live in the price tag. It doesn't matter if you bring a feast or a single grain of rice. True kindness and true thanks live in the heart. You've worked hard for this. You put your sweat and your time into these things just to say thank you to us." She paused, offering a small sad smile that reached her eyes. "We accept your gift, Hana, not because we need the food, but because we recognize the heart that brought it here. You've done more than enough." The tension that had been holding Hana upright seemed to evaporate. She let out a long, shuddering breath, her eyes closing as she leaned almost imperceptibly into the older woman's touch. For the first time since she had appeared at the gate, she looked like she could finally breathe. It was a profound lesson for everyone in that kitchen. In a world that often feels transactional, where every favor comes with a hidden cost, Hana's simple, desperate act of giving was a reminder of what it means to be truly grateful. But even as the warmth returned to the room, Huyen couldn't help but glance toward the window. The sun was fully up now, illuminating the garden where those strange footprints had been found earlier. The mystery of who was lurking around their house was still unsolved, and while they had found a friend in Hana, she couldn't shake the feeling that the danger hadn't quite passed. The kitchen was finally beginning to feel like a sanctuary again, the sharp medicinal scent of ginger tea cutting through the lingering tension. Huyen moved with a quiet grace, pouring a steaming mug for Hana, whose fingers were still pale and stiff from the morning chill. The girl took the cup as if it were a holy relic, the warmth of the ceramics seemingly the only thing keeping her upright. As Hana took a small hesitant sip, Dee's mother shifted in her chair. She wasn't one for small talk, especially when there were serious matters at hand. She had spent a lifetime reading people, and while her heart had softened toward the girl, her practical mind was already 3 steps ahead. "Hana, let's talk about the hard stuff for a second," the older woman said, her voice steady and grounded. "Do you have your papers? An ID, a birth certificate, anything? And is there anyone we should be calling family, friends? Someone who's looking for you?" Hana's gaze dropped to the tea. Her story came out in fragments, a jagged narrative of a life that had unraveled far too quickly. She spoke of a wrong turn, a string of bad luck, and people who had turned their backs on her when she needed them most. She wasn't a criminal, she was just someone who had slipped through the cracks of a world that doesn't have much patience for the lost. She didn't want a handout. She explained she just wanted a foothold. She wanted a place where she could work without being looking over her shoulder, a way to reclaim the dignity she'd lost somewhere along the cold, lonely road. Dee Hugh had been leaning against the counter, listening intently, finally spoke up. He was a man of action, and he could see a path forward where others might only see a dead end. "Look," Dee began, "the town market is always looking for extra hands. I know the owner of the diner up at the county seat. They're almost always short-staffed in the back washing dishes or prepping food. It's hard work, but it's steady." He paused, thinking for a moment. "And then there's the seamstress shop in town. The lady who runs it, she's a friend of the family. She's got a heart of gold but zero patience for people who don't work hard. If you can handle a needle and thread, I might be able to get you an interview there too." Huyen stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on the table. She saw the flicker of hope in Hana's eyes, but she also saw the sheer exhaustion. Finding a job was one thing, but survival in the meantime was another. "If you're okay with it, Hana," Huyen added softly, "why don't you plan on coming by here for lunch for the next few days? It'll save you some money, and at least you won't have to spend your afternoons wandering around with nowhere to go. We always make too much anyway, and we'd love the company." It was the final straw. The wall Hana had built around herself, the one made of pride, fear, and survival instincts, completely crumbled. She didn't just cry, she wept, a raw release of months of held-in terror and loneliness. She bowed her head so low it nearly touched the table, her thank yous muffled by her sobs, her gratitude so profound it was almost painful to witness. In that moment, they weren't just neighbors or strangers, they were a safety net. This mother stood up, walked around the table, and placed a firm but comforting hand on the girl's trembling shoulder. It was the touch of a woman who had weathered many storms and knew that the only way to survive them was together. "Dry those eyes, child," she said, her voice a soothing blend of authority and tenderness. "You've done enough crying for one lifetime. From here on out, if things get heavy, you speak up. You tell us what's going on. Don't ever let yourself get backed into a corner like that again. No one should have to face the dark alone." The kitchen grew quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence than before. It was the silence of a plan being formed, of a life being recalibrated. Outside, the sun was finally burning through the last of the frost, and for the first time in a long time, the future didn't look quite so cold for Hana. The family had made a choice. They had chosen to look past the red flags and the footprints in the garden to see the human being standing in front of them. It was a risk, certainly, but as the steam rose from the ginger tea, it felt like the only choice they could have lived with. The moment Hana turned the corner and disappeared from sight, the heavy emotional weight in the air seemed to lift, replaced by a sharp, stinging clarity. The house was quiet again, but it wasn't the peaceful quiet of the early morning. It was a silence filled with questions. Huyen decided to head out to the vegetable garden, hoping the fresh air and the routine of checking the crops would help her process everything. The sun was higher now, casting long dramatic shadows across the rows of greens, but as she reached the edge of the patch she froze. Near the back fence, where the soil was still damp and soft from the morning mist, a section of the leafy greens had been crushed. It wasn't the work of a stray animal or the wind. The stalks were snapped clean, flattened into the mud in a distinct heavy pattern. "Dig it out here for a second," Huyen called out, her voice tight with a sudden spike of adrenaline. They hurried over, wiping his hands on a rag. He followed Huyen's gaze down to the dirt. He knelt, his shadow falling over the disturbed earth. He didn't say anything at first, just traced the outline of a tread that was clearly visible in the dark soil. It was a heavy boot print, wide, deep, and definitely fresh. He stood up, his jaw set and his eyes scanning the perimeter of the fence line. "That's not my boot," he said, his voice dropping into a low protective register. "And it's definitely not yours." Someone was standing right here, Huyen. They were watching the house while we were inside with Hana. A cold shiver that had nothing to do with the winter air ran down Huyen's spine. The thought of a stranger lurking just feet away while they shared tea and stories made the safety of their home feel incredibly fragile. It was a classic gut check moment, the kind where your desire to be a good person slams head first into your primal instinct to protect your family. This mother had followed them out, leaning against the wooden post of the porch. She looked at the trampled vegetables and then at the worried faces of her children. She didn't look scared, she looked resolved. There was a stoic rural wisdom in her expression, the kind earned from decades of living in a world that wasn't always kind. "Don't let it rattle you," she said, her voice steady and calm, cutting through their rising panic. "People will do what they do. We can't control the shadows and we shouldn't let them change who we are. We live our lives right, we stay honest, and we keep our heads held high. If we start living in fear, then the shadows have already won." She stepped off the porch, her eyes locking onto Dee. "But being a good person doesn't mean being a target. Peace is something you have to maintain. From now on, that gate stays locked. We reinforce the fence and we keep our eyes open. We don't stop being kind, but we stop being easy." Huyen looked at Dee and he gave her a small solemn nod. The message was clear. They weren't going to turn their backs on people like Hana, but they weren't going to leave the back door open anymore either. It was a hard-learned lesson in boundaries. Your heart can be open, but your perimeter needs to be tight. "You're right," Huyen whispered, looking back at the footprint one last time before turning toward the house. "We can help the world, but we have to make sure we still have a home to come back to."